you, Simon, and thank you to Nomensa for having me. This is a really incredible honor. It's my first time in Bristol after having lived for 10 years now in London. I know I sound like I've just landed in England from America, but I'm Canadian-Italian, so there. I wanted to take the opportunity, I guess, to give you some thoughts before you break and join in on the wonderful sunshine outside on a super beautiful Friday, and to try to think about the work that you do in design in perhaps a different light. Some of you will leave this talk thinking that it has nothing to do with what you do for a living, and it's not very interesting. And hopefully some of you will hear this talk and think completely differently about what you do and think about the opportunities that lie for you both locally and or across the UK, really. And I'm hoping that, in a way, this isn't a talk. This is more like an invitation, and an invitation to act. I think that in the field of design, very broadly, we define acting in very different ways, and I see the impact of acts as being more and more limited by the tools that we use. And I think that there are acts that we can pose on an everyday basis as people that change the course of how we live and how we work. So I'll talk about that and a great many other things. A little bit about myself, if you haven't read the little booklet or online. I basically started in this country by being one of the first distributors of the Arduino. Who knows what the Arduino is? Excellent. Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. Who's actually bought one? Keep your hand up. Okay, and if you bought one, who's actually made something with it? So there's like hovering 1-ish, 2 or 3. Okay, cool. It doesn't matter for this, which is why I didn't put a picture of it, but it's always useful to know how much this stuff gets around. And it's essentially an electronics education platform. If you've heard of the Raspberry Pi, it's like a cousin of the Raspberry Pi. And now I have a consultancy called Design Swarm. I make a connected product for families called the Goodnight Lamp. And I have been running next week for 5 years the Internet of Things meetup in London. And my background is therefore very much steeped in hardware, in a way. And I think hopefully an interesting addition to the conversations you've been having today, which are about software and what happens online. I see a lot of what happens also offline and what people try to do. I also think that today is kind of a special day. Again, if you step out, and I stepped out and looked across to the wonderful cathedral nearby, there's a huge sort of memorial in light of today, and it kind of got me thinking. I was thinking, I wonder what we'll remember of this year, because so far it's not very great. And certainly, I think that I'm a big fan of Julian Barnes. He's a wonderful English author, and I think that he describes, with one of his latest book, he has this fantastic expression called the noise of time. And I think that what we are experiencing these days is a lot of things that will eventually combine into the one thing you can remember about this year, or maybe the one thing you can remember about the past 5 years, when we're older and grayer and wiser. And it sort of always gets me thinking about what I could be doing right now to make that time meaningful and not seeped in necessarily trauma, but seeped in opportunity and seeped in action. And I think that as designers, we're, I think, supposed to be really good at that. We're supposed to be really good at turning trauma into action, turning opportunities into tools, and helping people in real ways. And turning events into discussions, and eventually actions and community actions and results. And I don't necessarily mean results in terms of clicks. I don't mean results in terms of sales. I mean results in terms of the people we meet and whom we might want to work with. You know what, I hope, it's so pale, it's such a mistake. The actions for the people that we interact with, generally the choices that we make in our day-to-day lives, but the choices that we get other people to make because of what we build. We have a huge amount of power with the digital tools that we build. We have more power than we really realize. And certainly this week's American election, a lot of the conversations about the digital tools we've built for ourselves and how that has influence in politics. That's pretty interesting. It's no longer just traditional media. It's not, oh, the newspaper said X. It's the newspaper and everybody else said X, Y, and Z. And I think that design is about that tangible action, that tangible change, and that tangible choice that you make on a day-to-day basis about who you work with and how you work. Because I think we're aware of some of the consequences of what we build, but we often are not aware of all the consequences of what we build. My kind of pet hate are these kinds of services at the minute. And I want you to think about the work environment in the 1950s for a woman, for example. The work environment in the 1950s for a woman would have been, in some environment, you might have become a nurse if you were lucky enough and your parents kind of believed in you. Some of you, or some women, would not have had any education whatsoever because the father died, and so the daughter had to go to work because nobody was earning in the family. And others would have become typists. And this is an interview from some people who work at services like TaskRabbit. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the type of person who works there is a person like Leah, who is a former ballerina and married her high school sweetheart. In my mind, I'm not sure that Leah should be working at TaskRabbit, really. I'm sure that Leah had other dreams other than working at TaskRabbit. And some of the things that they have to do include physically waking people up every day because a person does not want to put their alarm on, they don't have the physical strength, maybe they have mental illness of some sort that could be fixed by someone else, not a person who's coming to your door and answering and trying to wake you up, or getting meat that's sliced so thinly, it's kind of unreal. And so I think that we enable these kinds of people to have access to those kinds of opportunities. And we call them opportunities, but are they any better or any worse than being a typist in the 1950s? They're definitely worse than being a nurse. And I also think that design is about realizing when there's hypocrisy somehow in the system. I live in London, which is too expensive. I still love it. And in East London right now, there's something called the Collective, which is essentially a glorified bedsit, 1950s bedsit. So you get a room that's smaller than you would get in a hotel, even like a capsule hotel. And you get a television, you get power, and they take care of all your bills, and you've got communal eating space and communal play space, and you're supposed to be able to meet people and sort of build up a community that way. Who here spends over 50% of their income on rent? Okay. If I was asking this in London, there'd be more people with their hand up. Which is probably why I should move to Bristol. But in the 50s, if you spent over 50% of your income on rent, you were described as being poor. And the people who would put their hand up in a conference such as this would not necessarily describe themselves as being poor, but we've sort of subtly made people feel like that's okay. It's okay to spend, I think I probably spent 70% of my income on my rent. And that's kind of crazy. And I don't think of myself as being poor, but they would have been able to do so much more with that disposable income. They would have been able to put some money aside and not worry so much about ownership of property, all these things that existed there. but I'm being sold this apartment that's going to cost me 70% of my income because it's supposedly solving a problem for me, not continuing to place me in a position of long-term poverty. And I think that that means that we sort of have a role to play that we either refuse to acknowledge or are too kind of busy to acknowledge. We do our job, we go home on the weekend, we take care of our families, we pay into a pension scheme or buy a property, and we do the thing that we do. And I think that that's something that didn't necessarily used to happen in the design space. If you were a designer, not even 20, 30 years ago, I think you had a different view of what your career was about. I'm going to assume you can't read the blue stuff now. So, who knows what this is? You can shout it out. Thank you very much. The Whole Earth catalog was published in, I want to say 68. And this was a piece of print. Like, it's a magazine that was published for years and years, and it taught people about how to make their own milk from milking cows, how to build their own houses, how to build PV solar panels. And it was completely hand in hand with the kind of holistic view of what living should be like, because we had conversations about what it meant to be living and what it meant to be self-sufficient. Who's heard of E.L. Schumacher? 1, 2, 3, 4. During that same time, you had economists writing books about how small was beautiful and the way in which capitalism and the structures that we have around it weren't particularly built on any solid ground, kind of treating the earth like it's a revenue stream as opposed to a fixed asset that depreciates, obviously. So Stuart Brown was kind of part of that. And the Whole Earth catalog, I suggest you go have a look, and you can look at the PDF. They still have kind of downloads of that stuff. Who's heard about this? This is the India report. So the Eames, mostly known for furniture design, print design, film, were asked to go to India and to see whether India should develop its own manufacturing or it should rely on American partners to import manufacturing and import technology and computing power. And they were asked. They were designers. They'd worked with military contracts to build up their practice, but they were designers by training. And they were asked, what do you think? And on the basis of the report that they wrote in '58, India decided, you know what, we're going to invest in our own universities, we're going to invest in building up talent locally, and we're going to invest in training people up to become engineers and training them up to become designers and architects, etc. I don't see designers being asked those kinds of questions these days. And of course, you know, the kind of epitome of all that is Buckminster Fuller, which I'm hoping most of you know about. Someone who's described, and you kind of look at his Wikipedia page, you know, like, where does the breadth of his work end? Because he was an author, he was an architect, he was an engineer, he was a designer, he was an ecologist, he wrote books, he wrote kind of manifestos, incredible practice. And that's design. That's design in a kind of total design kind of way, but, you know, not in a branded way. And we remember him for an architectural piece, but the rest of his work is fantastic. Who's heard of Tibor Kalman? 1-ish, 2-ish, 3-ish. So Tibor Kalman was a graphic designer who lived in New York and sadly died now, but he was responsible for Colors magazine. And Colors magazines in the 80s and 90s was this really amazing experiment in trying to change people's minds about AIDS, about religion, about racial diversity, about equality. And they had these kind of shock tactics with graphic design, creating images that people really responded to and really thought were really shocking. And I would challenge us to think of, you know, the shocking image of the past 6 months, because there were so many, and in a way they all kind of blend into one, usually of Donald Trump screaming at someone. And I think that these people, what they have in common is seeing design as a marathon, as being part of the fabric of society, as being something that can influence people and also influence decision-making and build trust and build communities and build action. And I think that they also see design as not a race, but really a marathon. It's not about the next project. It's not about the next 6 months of your income. It's about what your entire design community is doing and where it's going and what people are interested in and what they should be interested in, but there's no money in right now. What should get some money and why isn't there any money for this kind of thing? And a real activism, a form of activism that goes beyond the 9 to 5 of what you can do during your day and what you can finish by Friday and then off to the pub. It requires action in a way that I think that we've forgotten. And sometimes you've got your hands tied behind your back. I don't know if anybody's read this. This was published, I think, yesterday. This is an article in the New York Times Magazine about why it's so difficult to build a website for government. And this is the experience of people working with Code for America, which is a great program that has been trying to bang its head against the US government to build digital services. The things that we in the UK kind of feel quite smug about because we've got GDS and we kind of go like, oh, this is fantastic. We've got a whole department whose sole purpose is to figure out ways in which government can get digital. But of course, a few weeks ago or so, there's suddenly this rumbling of like, oh, well, that was so great and it is so great. So what's happening? And nobody's necessarily writing to their MP about this. They're just letting the noise of time take over. Other things to do, other things to get worried about. The next 3 months, the next 6 months, the next project. But sometimes there's also kind of good conditions for that marathon. And sometimes there's opportunities that are hidden in places that you wouldn't necessarily go towards. And I think that in my field, certainly, I'd like to think that there are plenty of opportunities, and I'll talk about what they might be. But these are opportunities that have absolutely no money in them whatsoever right now. There's no funding around anything to do with hardware in the UK. There's very, very limited funding even in the rest of the world. And the ability to get the funding is limited, but the ideas are incredible. And the companies are incredible. And the people who have decided to quit their day job to do a hardware company right now are, in my opinion, incredible. And they're local. They're in the UK. So I'll give you a few examples, and I hope that you write them down and that you go check out what they're doing, because these are genuinely interesting companies, some of them with good websites, others with terrible websites. And it's not even about the website, it's what's behind it. It's the people behind it. It's the conversations that you could have about how what you do fits within what they need and how we can move them along somehow. So Buffalo Grid is a London-based company, and they have these little boxes they go and take to rural India where, they're farming communities and everyone has a smartphone, but everyone doesn't have power in their houses. So they walk around and they have a kind of weekly sort of setup where they show up in different places throughout the week. And they have agents on site with these boxes, and they just allow people to get power for their phones. And then they give them access to Wi-Fi, and people pay for it through micropayments. And they're having the best time delivering this because you're meeting people, and you're meeting people in parts of the world that are fantastic and really interesting, and with people who have access to the same technologies as you, but probably use them in completely different ways. But funding something like this in the UK, they've got now a little bit of help from, I think, the Environmental Agency or someone like that. But they need so much help and so much support. And the digital side of this is, still to be determined. And the product design side of things is what it is, but they're working on manufacturing. And these are people to look at and to go, how can I help? Because maybe this is interesting to you. Another startup that's in London, they have now been kind of working on this for 4 years now, I think. And this is a smart plug for elderly people that just monitors the activity around that plug. So you can choose any plug in your home to replace with this smart plug. And all it does is looks at motion around it. So it's not even necessarily monitoring the thing that is plugged into it. It's more to say that actually we're going to put it where grandma plugs the kettle in so we can tell if she's made tea or not. Or we're going to put it next to, the bathroom so if she falls down, we know that something's happened. And they have been looking for funding for ages. And now they've just started their first production. You can see it on their Twitter feed, and they're starting to talk about this, but it's taking them far too long for something that would really change the life of a lot of the people that we love and who are on their own in homes and who will fall in the bathroom and who will not be found for 2.5 hours and then incur hospitalization costs that are crazy and then suddenly end up in a care home because they've lost all kind of ability to move their muscles because they've been in hospital for 2 weeks and they broke their hip. This changes lives. It's not exciting, I get it. And I get that it's not a transportation app and it's not the Uber of X, Y, and Z and it's not the, Deliveroo of Y and X, but that changes lives. That changes people's lives and it makes people more secure, happier, and safer in their own homes, whether they want to be in their own homes or not. This is another little startup in London. What they developed is something called Ollie Tool. They're called Ogenblick as a company, but they are developing a wearable device that helps you deal with anxiety. So something that basically helps you to keep a diary around your level of anxiety if you have mental health issues. So very simple, it's almost like beads or like a little rock, and they're trying to work on the best product design solution, and they're trying to work out what the best interfaces to the healthcare system might be. And they're really, really early stage. They just got a little bit of funding by Nomensa Trust, which is a funding body. And they're 2 women with a part-time CTO that's based in Milton Keynes, and one of the women lives in the US. So the tiniest possible teams with a little tiny bit of money. And they need help. They will need design help, and design from user research to how they deal with interface design to the whole services and how it's laid out. These people are here, and I think what they're doing is interesting. Again, it changes people's lives. It changes people's relationship to their health. Instead of this being a really, awful process of trying to just show up at the doctor's once in a while, it becomes this constant thing, and you feel supported through this interaction. Non-existent website number 3. This is a young woman who is working on a wearable device for women in India to wear in order to report whether they have been if they're being attacked or someone's trying to rape them, and they will send out kind of an emergency signal through this wearable device. They're working on the prototypes, they're working on testing right now in India. The founder is from India, so she's kind of over there and trying to just figure out how this works, what's the best way, how to make it discreet so someone doesn't snatch it away from you. This stuff changes lives. It's got hardware in it, and that's expensive. It takes a long time, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But these are companies that could use designers. This is a really long this has been around for a long time, but I still try to push people towards them. They're called Air Quality Egg, and what they make is an air quality sensor that you attach to your balcony or outside your window, and it will put on a map what the air quality is around your home. And the idea being that hopefully something like this becomes so viral that everybody has them in their home, and you're able to tell if your children are asthmatic or you've got health issues and you just can't understand why, whether it's actually linked to air quality. Unfortunately, government has very little interest in helping us identify air quality at a very granular level, usually, because it would mean that they would need to do something about traffic, which is difficult because it means you need to invest in transportation, which they don't want to do. So it has to come from people. It has to come from somewhere else. It can't actually come from government in this sense. And so these kinds of projects, and they built all of this through Google Groups. And so the team was completely across the world. They got an architect to do the product design, and the engineering was done literally from people sending each other files, and they were never in the same room. And now a company in the US actually distributes this, but getting that to scale, getting people to notice, telling the right story, telling the story about why you'd want to invest in something like this is something they don't have resources for. And again, people like yourselves are really perfect for that. And there's an area of development that I really love, which is everything to do with agri-tech. So agricultural technologies are amazing. People are really completely rethinking the way in which agriculture happens. This is a US company, a kind of small group of people really, looking at how you might make automated planting and kind of using CNC technology in order to grow things. And they've made it open source. And so you can download the files, you can set it up yourself, and you can grow your own little patch of whatever it is. Obviously in England you've got, slug problems galore, but there are things suddenly you can start to go, well, how do I adapt this for the UK? How do I make this work? Because we should be eating more locally, especially if our food, and most of our food comes from abroad, and that food starts to get more expensive, which it will. This is another agri-tech project, which is a group of people who have decided that they're going to make an open source version of every single piece of farming equipment out there. And so they're making 1 to 2 machines a year, and they're slowly going through the list of all of the machines ever. And they're making it out of things that you can find anywhere, because they want to open up farming so that you don't have to buy from John Deere a huge piece of kit that you then don't really own because they kind of rent it out to you. They make you believe you're buying something, but you're really renting something out, and you can't even service it. So opening up that whole market really makes a difference to people who want to be able to farm, and in communities where farming works at a very small scale. And they're doing this really slowly with almost no support. No financial support of any kind. But again, how do you tell that story, and how do you get people excited about this? How do you get people excited about making their own somewhere else? Because the job of designing it to begin with is long, but the job of getting everybody else on board is even longer. This is a Swiss company also in the farming sector, and this is the last example of farming. It's Swiss company, a startup called Jemaya, and what they're doing is, it feels like it's really dull and it's really sort of common in the agricultural space. So they take satellite images of a piece of land, and then they analyze it. And a lot of people do this. But what they do, in addition to that, is they go and they tell you when you buy a crate of tomatoes, the tomatoes came from this place, this is how much fertilizer was applied, this is how many people picked it, and this is how much they were paid, which nobody does. Nobody has that front and center, and they certainly don't want to tell you how much they're paying people. And that is a startup that is looking for funding, looking for resources, looking for help. And they've got a really big job ahead of them, because in Europe, the biggest company is not Monsanto, because they're not there yet, but Syngenta, which is a huge company that does agriculture at scale. And they've been sort of looking around, looking for support. And then my last example is one guy. It's literally a person with a couple of partners. So Ben Ward is based in Oxford, and he's made something called Flood Network. And Flood Network is it's really silly in a way. You put sensors underneath bridges and you measure the height of the water and you map that in order to be able to tell when there will be flooding, because it turns out that that's done over a period of time. It doesn't happen like this. And you can give people a warning if they decide to, let's say, follow their own bridge or the bridge next to the house. You know, you can decide to turn on notifications for your local bridge. And then you would know, okay, I need to go buy some sandbags or we need to move the furniture upstairs because something's happening in the next 12 hours. We don't know what's going on. He has found absolutely no support from anybody in government, from nobody in local council. And he's worked with Nomensa on the kind of data side of this and capturing the data and making it live. And so everything works, but nobody wants to take care of the problem. And nobody wants to own that problem. So once again, is it a buy your own sensor and stick it under your local bridge, whether it's legal or not? Or do you make that case and make that case loud enough that the local council doesn't have a choice but to say, okay, we'll pay? Because right now they look at this and they go, no, it's difficult. Well, we don't know if it's gonna flood. We know it's gonna flood. We don't know where, but we know it is. So these are all local companies doing super exciting things that sometimes involve hardware, all of the time involve software, and who usually don't talk to a designer for the first year and a half of their life as companies. And I'll tell you why, and I think it's important for you to know why, which is that they have 99 problems. And these are some of the problems that they would have typically if they're doing hardware. You're going from worrying about whether you've got IP on it to seeing if you need to license someone else's IP to the product design, the connectivity, is it working? Why isn't it working? Does the firmware need to be updated? Are the electronics sturdy enough? Is it waterproof enough? And some of these, yes, relate to design, but a lot of them don't. And so in people's minds, the design bucket is the last bucket to address because it feels like somehow the easiest one to sort of work on and the one that's not key, which is of course a mistake, and everybody in this room knows this, and user-centered design and all of that. It doesn't mean that that message actually reaches any of those types of companies. What they're thinking about is making sure that their product works and they can get a bit of funding. Never mind how many people find it useful or find it easy to use. And so design is put in a box that's the last box to open. And so I think that there's a role for you, not necessarily to be told who to go to, but for you to sort of get up and go meet people who don't even know they need you, who haven't put a job ad up, who are just doing interesting things, maybe in a sector that interests you, but you have absolutely no clue about, like most of these companies. And also by doing things slightly differently. And I'll show you examples of how I do this for my own work. Because otherwise, if I'm not eating my own dog food, why am I here? I think that there are ways of doing work that sometimes don't involve clients and sometimes put ideas forward that would never exist if there was a client. If there was a client, you'd end up with a completely different result. And collaborations across other sectors would not happen either. You'd end up working with the people you're kind of used to working with or you're comfortable working with. But that's not the point of doing things in a new way or doing things differently. I mean, we can all just go on doing the things we're comfortable with, but it means that we don't learn and we don't change. If we're not changing, then what are we contributing to the field? So I decided to start last year a project called The Good Home. And The Good Home is essentially a collaborative exploration of the future of home living, because I'm interested in homes. I'm interested in the home space. I've designed a product for families, but I'm generally interested in that space, and I thought that that space is designed for in the way that people designed for the 50s housewife. And I was frustrated with that. So the Good Home is a series of public events where people from different sectors of creativity at large come together, and they propose something that they'd like to showcase. So we had the London Design Festival, we had the Milan Furniture Fair, we had the Mozilla Festival, and every time it's a number of people I kind of gathered around me, and people worked in little groups or on their own or whatever it is, that however they wanted to work. And they came and they just showed something. And we'd workshopped common values, but that's about it. Nobody was paid for that work. Everybody did it in their spare time, and the results of which are things that don't exist on the market right now, but could very easily. And are completely different approaches to building homes, to building interactions in the home, to treating the home as a sort of financial space, to how people are living across generations in a home. All of those thoughts, all of those ideas would not exist if I had knocked on the door of Honeywell or British Gas or whoever and said, I'd really love to do an exploratory project on the future of the home. And they would have told me probably, oh, we did that. We did a video on future home living. And I would have responded, yes, and it sucked. And I don't like having conversations that are, where I am necessarily constantly disagreeing with the person. So this is a way of just being proactive and acting instead of reacting and defending a point of view. Building communities with no return on investment in mind whatsoever. So the IoT community in London, if you go to iot.london, which is a URL I only got because I asked the community to help me get it because it was £250 just for the domain name, is a website that goes along with all of the meetups that we've been having for 5 years. There are resources on that website. People can go and can see lists of books that they should read. People can go and learn about the startups that are nearby. None of this is there to make any money. None of this is there to be anything other than a useful tool to encourage people to meet other people and to just get a sense of what's going on. I don't think that there's a Bristol Internet of Things meetup, is there? There is? Excellent. Very good. I encourage you to go there, and I encourage you to go meet the people locally who are doing fantastic work, probably. Who runs it? Do we know? We don't know who runs it. You can't name, okay. Okay. You've been to it. Okay, cool. I'll have to look it up. Everybody always asks me, so why are you doing this? Like they're looking for some motive, like they're looking for me to say, well, I'd love to sell it to Google, And there's none of that. Why wouldn't you build a community around a topic area you were interested in? Why wouldn't you build? You take the time, yeah, sure, it takes some time, but everything takes time. And I'd rather do that than watch television, frankly, which I don't, which makes it super awkward here. And then build ideas that are kind of free to use and open to collaboration. I was having a bit of a moment on the week of the Brexit. As an Italian living here, I'm a little nervous. And I decided to build something called Made Near You. And Made Near You is kind of really simple and really dumb, but I'm hoping that people can help me build it, which is a website where you would put the food producers near you. And it maps them. So you look up a postcode and then it tells you who's making food near you. And not restaurants, but people who literally are producing food. Because I thought, hey, I was at the time in a small village in Scotland, and there are loads of people making great food, but there's also a Tesco. And so most people who are not familiar with the town are going to go shop at Tesco because it's like a recognizable thing. And so I would have skipped on helping out 4 different businesses by going shopping for vegetables here, buying a piece of meat there, milk there, and meet people, and talk to them about what they're doing, and just engage with the local community. And this is a project that has no intention of ever being anything other than something that people can use if they want to. And I will ever so slowly add local businesses from the places I go to and from the databases I can find. Generously enough, the area of Cumbria decided to send me their data, so I'm very slowly adding all of the food businesses around Cumbria. If there's anybody here who has any kind of links to what the data might be around here, that'd be amazing. Just let me know. But it's, in a way, a really simple and really solidified act of design. It doesn't need to go anywhere other than being useful to people. And if it can change the way in which people shop locally, amazing. Will I ever put advertising on it? No. In the way that some projects just don't need it. Some projects just need to be seen by people in a room once in a while and have that momentum going in the background. Not everything needs to be a unicorn, and not everything needs to have a hockey stick diagram. A lot of local businesses and local high streets don't ever have hockey stick diagrams, and they've been there for 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. And I think that idea of the kind of boutique design act, I think, is important. I think we decide on our time in ways that make that impossible. We work too much for a particular company, and then we move on to work for someone else, and we never give ourselves the time to do something for ourselves on the side that can contribute and can open up possibilities for you. Yes, sometimes the possibilities are opened up or professional, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're just the fact that suddenly you know people who make really good gin around you. So I think that the only thing I really want you to think about is how you're either acting inside your design box or you can act outside of your design box. I think we don't really realize how much of a box we have around us until we attend other people's conferences. And I have the great privilege of being able to ping pong around different types of conferences, and more often than not, you never meet the same people because everybody's having isolated conversations about their field of practice. And I think we have to change that, and we can only change that individually. And if every individual action suddenly leads to things changing because small little things are being developed and small products are being developed that never would have been developed otherwise, collaborations happening that never would have happened otherwise. I think that's how you build influence and build trust. So I guess the litmus test, in a way, for my talk, when I hopefully come back to you at some later point in the next years, would be to see if you've done anything differently. And if you've acted in a different way, if you've thought about what you're doing in a completely different light, and if you've spoken to people you never have spoken to about what you do, about what you're capable of doing, because you'll find that the people around you who might not be in technology at all, they might not be in digital at all, maybe they're in hardware, maybe they have a shop, suddenly they look at what you're doing and they go, oh, wow, that's great. I've always, wanted to do this, or this has been something that's bothering me. Can you help me with this? And more importantly, for you to be able to act on that, not to sit there and listen and have empathy, but also to act and to decide to take the time to do something about it. And that will be the litmus test of whether this has been either completely useless to your day job or a little bit useful. And I wish you good luck, and thank you very much for your time.